Welcome to Friday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live here on Giants.com as well as the mobile app. He's Paul Dottino. I'm Lance Medow with you for the next 60 minutes. The program presented by Cadillac, the official luxury vehicle of the New York Football Giants. Multiple ways you can interact with us here on the program. You give us a ring, 201-939-4513. You can also hit us up on Twitter, hashtag GiantsChat, and directly to the two of us, at Lance Medow, one word, last name, Medow. He is at Giants WFAN. And as a reminder, you can find the archive of this show and our entire podcast network on the Giants mobile app, podcast platforms everywhere, and at Giants.com/podcast. So the Senior Bowl game is this weekend. That will wrap up the all-star section of the offseason in terms of these prospects. Then we'll start to move towards the franchise tag as well as free agency before things pick up again on the draft front. And we have a lot of coverage all across Giants.com. If you're looking to read up on the prospects, Paul and I recently recorded Mock Draft Tracker 2.0 because each and every week we're going to be looking at where players are projected to go in the vicinity of where the Giants are selecting with number 6. And we'll get into a little bit of that a little bit later on here on the program. But we also figured today would be a good time to put into summary where the Giants are with respect to their defensive coordinator search, as they are still seeking a replacement for Wink Martindale. According to reports, remember, the Giants don't make anything official in terms of who they've interviewed when it comes to assistants. That's normally done when we're talking about the head coaching front. But according to reports, Brian Daboll has spoken with a variety of different candidates, both internally as well as externally, and some of them have already been hired. Case in point, Denard Wilson. He got the Baltimore Ravens secondary position. Are you okay? Are you in a good position?
I did not want to leave this open bottle of water next to our computers.
I got
so
you.
I had to get the cap off the floor.
Sounds good. It's a very active beginning to this show, as you can see. Yes.
I'm being very prudent.
You are. You are being extremely prudent.
It would be a terrible mistake.
75 different activities going on.
I know, but it would be a terrible mistake to leave an open bottle of water next to a computer.
Would be. You are being very careful, and we are
especially since it was more next to mine than it was yours.
Well, then I'm not worried then about the risk management then, because that's more of your computer.
Go right ahead. I was listening to you.
Oh, no, I figured you were listening. I just didn't know what was going on. I was paying more attention to what I was saying.
The cap has been discovered.
Now the cap has been put back to the spot that it's supposed to be. So we can finally receive some closure here on the program.
For those of you not watching this program, the cap to the water bottle up here on the desk fell on the floor. And
Paul was doing a juggling act.
Yes. I had to retrieve it.
And that forced him to leave his position.
Scoop and score, as we say here in the building.
Oh, that was some convoluted scoop and score. I don't know if that was a very smooth one. That was the ball bouncing around a little bit before you essentially secured it. But in all seriousness, as I mentioned, according to reports, the Giants had spoken with a variety of different candidates. Denard Wilson was a popular name. We've brought him up multiple times, Paul. He has since taken the Titans defensive coordinator job. Mm-hmm. Bob Babich was another name that was brought up. He was on the Bills staff. He has been promoted to Bills defensive coordinator as he is going to stay with Sean McDermott's staff. So the Giants, they have internal candidates, specifically Jerome Henderson, their secondary coach. And Shane Bowen has been a name that was reported that Brian Daboll spoke with. And he, unlike Jerome Henderson, has called plays, served as the defensive coordinator under Mike Vrabel going back to 2021. Tennessee now has a brand new staff because Brian Callahan took over as the head man. So there are still candidates that are out there that have not taken jobs. But
did you mention Brandon Daly?
Brandon Daly, I had not brought up. He's a Kansas City Chiefs assistant who goes back to Brian Daboll's days at New England. So I would say those two individuals plus the internal ones, that's where I think we are right now, at least based on what has been reported out there through the media.
Anthony Campanelli has not been
he
hired by anybody, or have the Dolphins?
Double check,
Have the Dolphins decided to hold on to him?
Well, Miami has not hired anybody to replace Vic Fangio. So anyone who is on the Dolphins staff has not, to my knowledge, been promoted. So we could throw him into the mix as well. He's the linebackers coach for the Dolphins.
Yeah, now, he's interesting, if only because he's a North Jersey guy.
Yep.
Obviously, the entire family is football royalty in high school, New Jersey football
Rutgers
circles, and ties to Rutgers for sure. And he's a very Jersey guy. I mean, truthfully, you talk about Tommy DeVito being a Jersey guy. Anthony's a Jersey guy too, big time Jersey guy. And if you know anything about him, he's tough. He's Jersey tough. He's Jersey smart, and he's the kind of guy where you could see at some point he's going to be running a whole unit. To this point, he's only been a DB coach, I believe, right, with the Dolphins.
Well, he was the linebackers coach going back to 2020.
Did he?
But
do
he
DBs
has
first?
been a DBs coach.
Yeah,
so
he did that
college,
first, right?
In college, not in the NFL.
Yeah. So he's had DBs and he's had backers, but at some point I think he is going to be somebody's DC, and whether or not it's here, I just don't know. But he's very, very vocal. He's on the field.
Well, he was featured on Hard Knocks a little bit, if you watch that.
I did not see the Dolphins series.
Hard Knocks, so he was a big part. They got him in the room interacting with players.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
So you know what I'm talking about.
Sure.
He fits the profile very, very well. I don't know, to be frank with you. I've never had personal interaction with some of these other candidates who have been reported, whether it's the Chiefs guy or the guy from the Chargers. And, I don't know these people in any way, shape, or form other than what we all read. I mean, that's the beauty of being able to do this program. We'll tell you what we don't know. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know anything about these folks other than what I read and what you can read. Now, at some point in time when they get here and I get to meet them and I get to talk to them, and certainly once somebody like that is hired, I will make phone calls to people I know around the league and say, okay, this guy is coming in. What do you know about him? But at this point, it's so premature. There's a wide scope of a handful of guys who are been reported to interview for the job. I'm not doing that right now.
Well, you can only judge them based on their resumes. Because
right.
personality
and to be
is not
honest,
something that comes to mind.
As a position coach, it's really hard to differentiate what is his part of the resume and what is the coordinator's part who he worked for.
No, that's very fair because you don't know what scheme or system they'll bring in if they are a first-time defensive coordinator.
I'll give you a great example. I mean, I don't want to interrupt you, but it's important. This is an important point because it goes directly to the heart of what we're talking about. Jerome Henderson is widely regarded around the NFL as an outstanding defensive backs coach. That you talk to anybody at the combine, I'm not at the Senior Bowl or the Shrine Bowl, but talk to anybody around the league and they'll tell you they know who Jerome Henderson is. They know that he played in the league for several years. They know he has served his dues around the NFL as an assistant coach. And we certainly know how the Giants feel about him because he has already gone through 2 regimes.
Yep.
Okay? And the production of his young players has been good. He's gotten quality production out of guys. So I truly believe he's an excellent defensive backs coach. I see it firsthand. Do I know how good of a defensive coordinator he would be? I don't know that. He's never been in that chair before. I have great respect for him as a man. I have great respect for him as a defensive backs coach. Can I project and say he'd be a great defensive coordinator? Maybe he will. But I don't know that because it's hard for me. Certainly, I was not in the interview that he may or may not have given to Brian Daboll about if you're going to be a DC, what's going to be your approach? What do you think your strengths are? What do you think you're going to need to lean on to succeed in the new role? I don't know the answer to that. Heck, I don't even know if Jerome Henderson himself knows if he's going to be a great defensive coordinator. He may not. I'm sure he has confidence in himself, but he may not know 100% how great he would be in that job. And that's the one gray area when you promote a position guy into a DC spot. And we talked about this yesterday, that there are a number of assistants who have never been DCs who are on this supposed list that the Giants have. Well, the other question that you have to answer is if you make one of your position coaches the DC coach, you now have to fill that other spot. And so now if Coach Henderson moves up, they got to shop for a secondary coach, and God only knows with the youth in that secondary, that guy they get better be as good as Coach Henderson was.
Well, they could also promote a defensive assistant who maybe didn't have a position group.
They could.
I think it's a little bit easier to do that, Paul, than worry about the reversal, because obviously the big priority is find the defensive coordinator. If you got to move some people around who are on staff, at least you're also maintaining continuity. And that's what comes back to, if we're going to weigh all of these candidates here, the reason why Jerome Henderson is extremely appealing, regardless of whether or not he's been a play caller, is he's got a wealth of knowledge and experience.
No question.
You cannot take that away from him.
As does Coach Patterson.
Correct, without a doubt. And Patterson, once again, has served the role of co-defensive coordinator. But when you're talking about Henderson, amongst all of these candidates that we've been discussing, he goes back to his playing days in 1991, Paul. Mm-hmm. Nobody else that we've been talking about has been in the NFL since 1991. Played through 1998. Has been a coach going back to 2007. And here's the other thing that shows the diversity of his resume that we didn't bring up. Henderson, for 2 years, was also the director of player development for the Jets. So he's got player experience, front office development experience, and then positional coaching experience. And he has held a variety of different titles. He's been a DB's coach, been a passing game coordinator in terms of defending the pass. So those things jump out to me. And then the major question is, and we've talked about this in passing, what is the biggest priority for Brian Daboll? Does he want continuity? Because as you mentioned, even though Jerome Henderson has not called plays, the chances of continuing some of the things that wink around are better with Jerome Henderson at the controls versus you bring somebody externally, and I'll throw Andre Patterson in too because he was on staff, versus you bring in somebody from outside of the organization. I don't think a good game plan is, just like you never want to force a head coach to hire assistants, right? They should pick who they want. Worst thing you want to do for a coordinator is tell them what scheme they want to run, right? They should be able to run what they think is most comfortable. So Henderson and Patterson give you more flexibility, and they'll have their own tricks up their sleeve, right? Because they want to define themselves as a coordinator. But I'm sure they're also open to keeping things in the playbook that Wink had implemented. And that's not only good for the coaches, it's also good for the players, because the players are used to running those things from a season ago. So is that important, Paul? Is that the biggest priority for Brian Daboll? Or does he say, you know what, fresh slate, clean slate, I want a new set of eyes, I want a new voice? You can make an argument to go in either direction, I would say.
I don't think there's any doubt. And that's why this is such a mystery for all of us. None of us are going to be able to project exactly what the Giants are going to do. It's a wide open slate. Now, I will say this, okay? Coach Henderson, who, in my opinion, from just watching the way he coaches, he's a teacher.
Oh, yeah.
He's a really good teacher. Some coaches just want to bring the plays out, and they rely more on the players to pick it up. And they're like, this is what we want you to do. You guys have to learn this and blah, 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 blah. Just go out and do it. Coach Henderson won't only tell you what needs to be done, but he'll tell you why. He is a teacher. He gets into the background of what we're trying to do philosophically so that you understand the concepts, and it makes it easier for them to pick up the plays. See, I've seen many coaches who are not, quote, teachers. They're more or less, I don't know what the word is that I would use. Coach Marvin could probably help us if he was on the line. But there are some coaches who will literally just deliver the information to you.
The message, yeah.
They're messengers. They're more messengers.
Or
position coaches who can be intermediaries or messengers, and they're not necessarily great teachers who will go above and beyond the plays that are on the play sheet. And that's what I think really, in my opinion, makes Jerome Henderson just an outstanding coach who I would want on my staff any day of the week.
The other thing on the topic that you're talking about that has jumped out to me, and if Giants fans haven't had an opportunity, if they just want to get to know a little bit more about Jerome Henderson, throughout the season, assistants on Fridays, right, talk with the media, Paul. And there is usually a great montage that our production team puts together of that entire session. And Henderson is featured, every other week. I want to say the assistants spoke pretty much throughout the regular season. And this goes to the point that you were emphasizing. When you listen to Jerome answer questions about his players, he does a great job, to me, of balancing, not throwing a guy under the bus, but he can be critical of their play and what they've been discussing behind closed doors,
right,
and explain what they're working on to improve the production of that play. I don't know. I've always noticed that with Jerome, and that's not to say that other assistants don't do a good job of balancing that, but he has had a lot of young guys in his room.
He's an impressive guy to listen to.
Correct. And I think part of that also is, and this doesn't mean that you had to have been a former player, but the fact that the man lived it, breathed it, and has been there.
It looks like he could still play, too.
Correct, he does. But I do think that registers in the minds of guys in his position room. You know, Jerome, he could talk about the 1995 season when I was with the Eagles in Week 10, when I went up against so-and-so, this is what we did. He doesn't have to come up with a hypothetical situation.
Oh, no.
He can give you real tangible life experience. And I think that registers in the minds of players. And it's no different than if you look at this NFL coaching cycle, not to get off topic, there were 3 former NFL players that received head coaching positions.
Yes.
So that's nearly half of the turnover rate that we saw in the NFL. They decided to go in the direction of individuals that have been there and done that. And I think that's the other appealing aspect about Jerome Henderson. He's seen it through the lens of being a player as well as a coach. And that brings, I think, a wealth of knowledge to the table.
I have not seen, by the way, any other names pop up in the last 48 hours as far as the internet reports of guys who were either asked about or may have come in for a conversation. So whether
and it's possible that at the last second they may choose to, until somebody's named, they have the right to speak with somebody.
No question. So
Yeah.
I guess all I'm saying is at least the information flow at this point seems to have trickled down to a halt.
And that's why we talked about this on Thursday's program, in case you missed it, about the fact that the level of urgency, Paul, now picks up because all 8 head coaches are in place, and now everybody is shifting through to try to find their respective coordinators. I mean, we've seen that with some of the teams in the division, with Dan Quinn now going after some candidates. We know Nick Sirianni already hired his 2 with Vic Fangio and Kellen Moore on defense and offense, respectively. Dallas is going to have to find a new defensive coordinator with Dan Quinn moving on. So there's almost a bit of competition. Forget the rest of the NFL within the NFC East, because as we've been emphasizing it, this is very rare. You don't see one division bring in 4 new defensive play callers. That is very unique and very rare, but here we are, which means this entire league is going to have to study up on completely new schemes this offseason, whether you have a new head coach or not, because anything that they ran last season, they could very well bring back some of those concepts, but new coordinator means new imprint that they're going to put amongst their players.
And how many of these hires will be ones that these teams get right? I mean, let's not kid ourselves, and you were the one all over it more than anybody else. The Eagles had to change coordinators during the last offseason, and it dramatically impacted that team, especially as the season went on and some of their warts became very obvious and they were unable to make the proper adjustments. And what happened? They had to clean that out.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think I've referenced this multiple times, and this is not to say that a guy like Jerome Henderson doesn't deserve to be promoted, but the flip side is the Eagles promoted from within
and it didn't
with
work.
Brian Johnson, and it didn't work out. And he had never called plays, and he was never a coordinator. Now, if you're comparing the two, though, this is where I say take a step back. Jerome Henderson compared to Brian Johnson's resume, it's night and day.
Not even close.
In terms of playing in the NFL, coaching in the NFL. So it's not the same wavelength, but it goes back to what you were highlighting. You just don't know until you throw somebody in that position. You don't know how they're going to be able to perform in that role.
You had said yesterday, and how true it is, at some point, okay, every defensive coordinator had to get that first job.
Yeah.
So
you got to take off the diapers and put on the big boy pants, right?
I really didn't need to get that visual, okay?
I'm giving you the most graphic visual just so that you can put it into other terms.
How about just the caterpillar has to turn into the butterfly at some point? How about
prefer
that?
the animal and the evolution.
Well, it's a little prettier.
That's fine. I think parents out there can understand the gradual progression of children.
Or at some point, the water's got to boil for that pasta.
So we knew we were going to bring it back to food. So there you go. We have human life, we have animals, and we have food. If we haven't covered the entire spectrum of the world, I don't know what's missing on that front. Lance Medow, Paul Dottino with you here on Friday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live. We just figured we'd summarize what at least has been out there through reports about candidates right now for the Giants defensive coordinator position. Few reminders before we open up the phone lines. Giants Huddle Podcast. You could subscribe to that on your favorite podcast platform. You could also go to giants.com/podcast. Looking ahead to the 2024 season, you can take your fandom to the next level with a season ticket membership. Stay connected to the club all year round, not just on game days. Memberships are now available for the 2024 season. To learn more about all the exclusive member benefits, visit giants.com/tickets. Limited inventory is available. And Giants official connected TV streaming app. It's Giants TV. It brings you original video content and game highlights on demand and direct to Big Blue fans. Giants TV, it's free. It's on Apple TV, Roku, Amazon Fire TV, as well as the Giants mobile app. All right, let's open up the phone lines as we move forward here, and we check in with Randy in California. Randy, welcome to the program. What do you got for us?
Hey, buddy, I'm sorry to call 2 days in a row. I'm not trying to sound like Wilson or anybody. But,
Well, listen, the fact that you got through on back-to-back days is an accomplishment, which means we need to now reevaluate our system and our process. But we'll let you sneak in here.
Well, I'm sure your comments and questions won't be as off the track as Wilson's are either.
Well,
no, I just, I'm hearing a lot about doing a possible tag and trade if they can't get it done with Barkley.
Okay.
What do you guys, if you guys are Shane, what would you do with Barkley? And I'll take your answers off the air. I appreciate you guys.
And appreciate the phone call. Thanks for giving us a ring here.
Well, I'm on the record as saying that I believe a deal will get done. I think Barkley wants to be here. I think he's made that pretty clear. I think the Giants want him to be here. And I think that the marketplace dictated last season what the new numbers or the ballpark of those numbers needs to be. And I think Barkley and his folks understand that. I don't hesitate to say that usually CAA represents players who want deals to get done. There are other agencies over the course of time who tend to cause a lot of aggravation and agitation, and they're more interested in just maxing out whatever the deal is for the player, and it doesn't matter what the player wants or where the player wants to play. They're trying to set the new market. They're trying to get the number that they can crow about. CAA is not like that. As far as my understanding of all the years that I've been around, CAA's priority is usually to get the player where he wants to play. And Saquon Barkley's made it clear that he wants to be here. He wants to be a Giants legend, and he wants to win here. So I fully believe that that's their intention. I think it's the Giants' intention. And when both parties want something to happen, odds are it's going to happen. That doesn't mean 100%, but I would say I'm standing on the cinder block that says they will get a new deal.
Well, there's two things that are different this go-around that I think are important to bring up. Number one, the Giants are not balancing a quarterback deal against a running back deal this offseason like they were last season, Paul. And that was big, right? Because you needed to say to yourself, well, the quarterback's going to be far more expensive, and the tag makes it a little bit more digestible, and we don't have to necessarily feel as if we want to bid against ourselves for the quarterback. So it's a bigger priority to maybe get that done. And then the running back position, if he's able to get out there, that maybe bodes better for us because running back contracts are not nearly as high as quarterback contracts. So you don't have to deal with that this time around. Then there's Barkley's mindset. Does Saquon, after going through what happened last season, where he wasn't able to test the market and he didn't get a lucrative long-term deal, does he say to himself, I don't want to go down that road again, and I want to now get some security on a multi-year deal if the team is willing to offer that, and I'm going to take that, and I'm not going to roll the dice because of injuries and everything else. So those are two things, Paul, that are now in the conversation that we were not discussing at this time last year.
Correct.
The mindset of the player and then what the team has to juggle. So that changes things. But what I will say is, and I know Joe Shane at I think it was his end of the season press conference, he had mentioned that just because you have the tag doesn't mean you want to use it every single offseason.
Correct.
Paul. He had said something in that ballpark, at least, with respect to the tag. The tag is valuable for the running back position because it's not a breaking the piggy bank open type of scenario. So if the Giants want to utilize the tag because, they don't want to allow Barkley to see what else is out there, because Barkley's a weapon. Remember, Barkley is not a conventional running back. He's a Christian McCaffrey-esque type of player. I'm not saying they're equivalent production-wise, durability-wise, but Barkley does things that most conventional running backs don't do. And he gets out there. You don't know. All it takes, Paul, is one team.
Correct.
So the tag is powerful from the standpoint of you're then just negotiating with Barkley. You're not negotiating with Barkley and the rest of the league. There's value to that. So if they want to at least go through the initial stages of giving him the tag so that they don't have to get into a bidding war, I think that has value at the end of the day. But I think like anything else, how many more years do you want to go through one-year deals and then revisiting it? So it bodes well for both sides to get some type of a multiple-year deal done so that they don't have to revisit this and that they have the tag to utilize on other players. But initially, before free agency starts, if they want to use the tag again, I do think that has extreme value.
I think to provide more clarity for folks, the tag can be applied beginning February 20th. Okay?
That's that grace period.
The tagging period starts February 20th and ends March 5th, which is the first day of unrestricted free agency. So you have 2 weeks during which you can apply the tag at any time during that 2-week period. Joe Schoen has already made it clear this week at the Senior Bowl that he's got an appointment to talk to Barkley's representatives at the Combine. The Combine does not actually start until February 27th.
After the tag period.
Correct. It's a week later.
Yep.
1 week will have expired during the tag period before the Combine starts. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you folks who are listening to this program now, if nothing happens when the tag period opens on the 20th, don't panic. Because Joe Schoen's already said he's not talking to Barkley's people till he gets to the Combine. Now, a lot of people will descend on Indianapolis the day before it starts. So he might be there on the 26th. Maybe Barkley's people will be there on the 26th. And maybe that's when they start talking. But the first week of the tagging period is pre-Combine. I don't think anything will happen because Joe Schoen has already said, I'm not talking to those people. I've got an appointment to talk to those people. I plan on talking to them at the Combine. So don't be fooled by the tweets and the stories that say on February 20th, if Barkley's not tagged, that, oh my God, this tells you something. It won't. Or if Barkley, you're going to get stories on the morning of February 20th or maybe the 19th. Tagging period starts. Watch for the Giants to tag Barkley. Chances are they're not going to do anything that first week because Schoen will not have had a chance to talk to his reps again. So that's a case of there's nothing here, folks. Move on. Go down the highway and move on. There's not going to be any news, I don't believe, until Joe Schoen meets with Barkley's people at the Combine. Then they'll have 1 week to have conversation before the Giants must decide if they want to throw the tag on him, because then the window closes and free agency starts on March 5th. So to me, the key period for what's going to happen to Saquon Barkley is basically February 26th to March 5th. That right there, that week, is where you really want to be attentive because you'll find something out about Saquon Barkley during that period of time.
Well, and remember, they didn't tag him until the very last second of the deadline.
Correct.
After they got a deal done with Daniel Jones. So
because they had to work with two guys at once.
No, but the point is, even with them not working through a Daniel Jones contract this time around, Paul, there's no advantage or disadvantage whether you tag the guy the first day of the period or the final day of the period. It makes no difference.
Correct.
Because you're not gaining an advantage in the negotiation.
No.
You can wait to see how negotiations go and then tag him at the very last second to avoid him to hit free agency. That's the whole purpose.
That's exactly why I'm telling you that the first week of the period is a know-nothing week.
No,
it means nothing. Now, what you could find out is that beginning, let's say, on the 26th, when the Combine starts, or the day before, you may find out that within a day or two, Joe talks to those reps, and maybe within 24 hours, they got a deal.
Yeah, they could very well get something done before the tag deadline.
And then you don't even have to worry about the tag coming by March 5th.
Well, and that's more of a reason why you wait to tag a player.
Exactly.
Because what's the purpose of tagging the player early if you still have some days?
It makes no sense at all.
Yeah.
Makes no sense at all.
So whether Barkley gets the tag early or late, I wouldn't read into it because, to your point, Joe Schoen's going to take advantage of the negotiating period overall before he makes a decision or is forced to make a decision, because there's not really an overwhelming amount of urgency. The whole point of the tag is you tag the player when you've exhausted all resources.
Correct.
You can't get a long-term deal done before the start of free agency.
And now you have to buy more time. And Barkley's made it very clear that he believes in his conversations with the Giants, and he hopes that they respect this process enough that they won't use the tag as a holding mechanism anymore. He pretty much had said during the last day of locker cleanout here that I hope sooner rather than later we figure out what's going to happen. Either we make the deal happen here and he's a long-term Giant, which is what he wants, or if they really don't want to make a deal, then they should just figure out a way to let me go. Because he does not want to be long-term tagged while they delay conversations. That he's made clear, and I do expect the Giants to be respectful of him in that way, because if you can't get this deal done, if both parties want it to be done, they should be able to do it within that weeks of time, that week of conversation. They should. If they can't, and for some reason, one side or the other decides it's not going to work, then I would think what you'll probably see is a tag, sign, and trade.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, so the tag could still come into play to facilitate a trade then,
right,
so that the Giants may get something in return,
yeah,
as opposed to losing him outright. So that's still in play. He may not love that, but the Giants, I don't think they're going to say, well, then
they
just
won't
walk
let him,
so that we don't get anything
I
in
don't
return.
see the Giants just letting him walk for nothing at all. I don't see that happening, but again, I don't believe it'll get to that point anyway.
Well, you would think, once again, since Barkley has a little bit of a different perspective, having lived it last year.
And he has said as much.
That changes his outlook. The team knows from conversations where he stands, or at least what the market's going to be. So you would figure that there would be more of a conclusion early this time around.
You would think
as
so.
opposed to the way it went last season. And
I concur.
by the way, I'm not even throwing Saquon Barkley into the equation. I would say the same thing with Josh Jacobs. I would expect Josh Jacobs and the Raiders to follow a very similar pattern, because they also went through pretty much the identical thing, right? Barkley and Jacobs both played on a reconfigured tag last season.
Now, I'll give you another part to this equation that's very interesting. And I'm not going to get into numbers because it's not my business, the numbers of what the players make or earn. That's not something this is not the forum for it. But what I will say is Barkley did have the sprained ankle last year. It did somewhat squelch his production. Well, many times in these contracts, part of the business mechanisms that you can use to help yourself cap-wise and then still help the player earn his potential salary is you'll use these incentive clauses. And in the NFL, when they gauge salary cap numbers, they talk about easily reached incentives and not easily reached incentives. Well, part of the way that you can really help yourself here is Barkley had less than 1,000 yards rushing this year, okay? So one of the things you can do is give him incentives and basically say, like they did this past year. They said you have to match the previous year's numbers or do better to get some of those incentives. Well, because his numbers were a little bit depressed this past season, those numbers won't be quite as hard to reach, and yet they could still be considered not easily reachable incentives according to the salary cap. So that actually works in the Giants' favor, because they could give him a deal with incentives that he believes he can reach. He probably, and rightfully so, thinks he's going to rush for 1,000 yards this year. Well, you can now put that in as a trigger. If he had run for 1,400 yards in 2023, you could not put 1,000 yards as one of those incentives to work against the cap, because it would be less than what he did the year before. But when you incentivize with numbers that were higher than last year's number, you can work some magic against the cap. That can work in the favor of making a deal here.
Well, keep in mind, though, according to multiple reports, though, all of those incentives were tied to the Giants making the playoffs. There was a team clause or a team accomplishment within that incentive.
And that's what George Young used to do.
But that makes it even more challenging for the player to reach that.
George Young used to tie the incentives to the team had to win at least 9 games and make the playoffs. And that way, George used to say that this prevented the individual from looking out too much for himself and just wanting X number of carries and give me the ball, give me the ball, give me the ball. No, I want the team to win because that's going to be my incentive to cash in. So I don't know exactly what his incentives were this past year, nor what they might be this year. But it's important to note, folks, that that's another thing that needs to be considered when you talk about the difficulty or the ease of making a deal. This situation should make it easier to make a deal.
Well, it can make a deal more attractive, I think.
Have I explained that well, by the way?
No, I completely understand where you're coming from.
You follow what I said?
But once again, the only thing that I would add is that sometimes there are team accomplishments attached to these incentives, which
there could always
completely changes
Again,
things.
George Young believed in that.
No,
so there could always be.
Sure.
And I don't know if that will or will not be the case.
No, that's in the eye of the beholder, what the team and the agents can negotiate. I mean, my personal opinion, though, is I'm not of the mindset that any incentives should be tied to team accomplishments. The whole point of an individual incentive is it's an individual incentive. It's based on the individual performance of the player. So, I mean, that's more of the agent, whoever negotiated that. I thought that was very peculiar, if, of course, those reports are accurate.
Well, you could always do part of one and part of another. There's nothing wrong with that.
Well, meaning one incentive, an individualized accomplishment, another one tied to the team.
You could.
Sure. Oh, yeah, you could mix and match. That's what I said. It's all based on how the negotiation plays
again,
out.
George Young's philosophy was the players should want the team to do well, and if you do just individual incentives, he thought that allowed the player to become more selfish. So he always tied them.
I get the thinking.
And it's a great mindset to have. And so if you wanted to have maybe a mixture of incentives, maybe you do that.
No, you could.
Trust me, if Barkley resigns here, he wants the Giants to make the playoffs and will do everything he can to make it happen.
I was going to say, I think that goes without saying. But the other thing is, and this is where the whole idea that a player is being too selfish, you could be an offensive player, Paul. You can have a tremendous season, do everything you can to help your team. Your defense is struggling like crazy.
I know.
What exactly is he supposed to do?
It can
happen. You know what I'm saying?
I get it.
You know, the defense and the special teams.
You're always looking at the player and the agent's perspective, and I'm always looking at management's perspective.
No, I'm looking at both.
It's okay.
I just think that, to me, having those things tied to a player incentive is just a little unrealistic, because it makes it that much more challenging for the player to actually
The Giants
achieve.
fielded a team during George Young's tenure here,
But
didn't
that
they?
was
They fielded a team.
And last I checked, a few decades have passed since he's been running the team.
But if you had been involved in player negotiations, they probably wouldn't have had anybody on the field.
Well, what does that mean? Well, because they would have had too much money that they would have had to pay out?
No, because you would have said, I'm not signing that deal.
No, I would have. No, I'm not. I'm just saying I'm for some individual player incentives. So that would have been easier to re-sign.
No, because George would have told you it's got to have team incentives involved, and you would have said, I'm not signing it.
No, I would have been more of the philosophy to work half and half, like you said.
Okay.
I mean, I could see that coming to middle ground.
Boy,
That's
we
the
would
point of
have
this conversation.
We would have a hell of a
ground.
time dealing with free agents if it was you against me at the table.
Well, listen, that's perfectly fine.
That would be a war that the King Kong and Godzilla would pale in comparison.
Well, that's why it's called negotiating. You give a little, you take a little. I think anybody in life can relate to that. All right, let's head back to the phone lines. We got Len in Maryland joining us here on BBKO. What's happening, Len?
Hey, gentlemen. Good to talk to you.
Hi.
Thanks for taking my call. You know, I hope anybody who's ever listened to this show over the years has ever underestimated the entertainment value of the show.
We try.
I mean,
we try.
Seriously, you guys' interactions with the callers are just great, and we got some great callers. I mean, I know, Wilson takes a beating every once in a while, but darn, he's entertaining when he
can be fun. Yes, he can. Yes,
at least one person said he was entertaining. So
yeah, there you go. No, I appreciate it. I think the reason why I listen. I love the calls, and it's great entertainment value. Okay, Lance, I wanted to comment on something you said earlier on the show, and I believe you were right on it. Let me start that conversation off by saying it's just the amount of turnover amongst general managers, head coaches, and coordinators. It's just unbelievable. I mean, 8 new coaches. I think we're probably 6 new GMs, and probably 14, 15, 16 coordinators on each side of the ball are new. Yeah. And, again, you referenced the division on the defensive side. with coaches and coordinators. And I think what I read into that is these owners are shortening the leash. I remember old John McKay when he left the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he didn't have a good run. Very entertaining guy.
Yes, he was.
And he did the best he could with a terrible team.
Sure did.
But one of the things he said at the end was that, I'll sum it up for you. If you can't do it in 5, you can't do it.
Mm-hmm. And now it's like maximum is 3, and you may not even get 3.
It's 3, and I'll put some time limits on it. For a general manager, I think it's 4. For a coach, I think it's 3, and for coordinators, I think it's 2. And I'm thinking back on where we've been on the previous 3 coaches, only around for 2 years. Maybe a little credit to John Mara. If it's not working, make the change. There's no reason to keep somebody if you think it's not working. So, I think the leash is getting a lot shorter, but Jesus, unbelievable turnover.
Well, but also, Len, the flip side of that is the teams that subscribe to every 2 to 3 years changes. How many can you say have had success as a result of that, though?
Yeah, well, you gotta keep searching for success, Lance. And if it's not with the guy you have, you got to go try and get somebody else.
Well, no, but I think also what you were hitting on is sometimes you do need time to get to that success. And if you don't give a coach or a GM the ample time to do that, then you're hurting yourself in the long run because prematurely you're making a change.
See, Len, one of the things, in addition to the much, much more heated media and fan scrutiny, which is a business part of the equation, let's not kid ourselves, it does factor in. The other thing is, and it took time to happen, but because of the free agency rules, the fact is you cannot keep these teams together for too long. And the bulk of those guys, they're going to be up for free agency. They're going to want their money. They're going to go to other teams. They're going to rip your roster apart. And you can't keep a team together for 5 years. So how is a coach supposed to say I have a 5-year plan when you know that at least half of his team is going to be gone?
Well, that's why the draft and developing those players is so critical, because that's the way to counter them.
So maybe you wonder, why does anybody want to be a head coach?
Oh, that's a really good question. Hey,
look.
Not me. Not me. I want no part of it, Len. I want no part of it.
Yeah, there you go. But, part of the job of the general manager is to spend the owner's money wisely. And, I'm just thinking about this year and the thing with Wink. I think not paying Wink that 3rd year, I mean, $3 million. Some people said $3.6 million. $3 million. When you're paying coordinators that kind of money, what does the head coach do? I mean, that's a lot of money for a coordinator. But I think that I think Joe made some points with ownership by not giving up that 3rd year with Wink.
That's why teams have leverage when an individual is still under contract, as opposed to becoming an outright free agent.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
Yeah. Listen, I won't keep you on too long. I got, with not much happening since the last time I called, when I kind of beat up on the roster, but not much has happened since then. But so let me finish, and I'll take your answer off the air if you care to comment. I've got some advice to give to Joe. And 2 pieces of advice to Joe Shane, 1 piece of advice to Brian Dable, and then I'll get off the phone. You guys can comment or move on to the next caller. All right, here I go for Joe. Joe, you don't have to get worse to get better. Protect your assets. We can get better coming off of last year. We don't have to shred this roster. I've never believed in getting worse before you get better. Secondly, Joe, hold on to that pick. We need stars. You got a better chance of getting a star, and there's going to be one there. All right? Those first 10 picks, man, there's some terrific ball players there. There's some guys who are going to be all pros. A good bunch of them in that first 10 picks. Hang on to that pick. We need stars. You win with stars, guys. We talk about complementary players and, things like that. Yeah, but basically, when you boil it all down, you win with less than 30 guys, but you really win with the stars amongst those 30s. And we need more stars on this team. Hang on to that pick. We're going to get a great player there. Brian, this team needs an identity. We didn't do anything well last year. We can't hang our hat on anything. We've got to establish an identity for this team. We got to start somewhere. You got to do something right next year. I got an idea. Let's build around the superstar we got on this team, and that's Dexter Lawrence. Let's stop the run. Let's stay 3-4. Let's throw 950 pounds of meat on that front line of that defensive line, and by week 4, let's watch people start talking about the Giants being able to stop the run. Hey, thanks for taking my call, guys. I'll get back to you next week.
Yeah,
I'd enjoy your comments. I'd enjoy your comments if you have any.
Okay. Yeah, I appreciate the phone call. Well, the first comment I would make is they brought in Nacho. They brought in A'Shawn Robinson. So this year you could argue they did look to build around Dexter Lawrence, and look at what happened.
And they brought in Okereke to man the middle.
Sure. So they did do exactly what Len was just preaching. And once again, I don't think the results turned out the way that they had anticipated. So identity, yeah, it's great to talk about, but comes down to the execution. I think if you're talking about identity of this team, I think the identity needs to be achieved on the offensive side of the ball, because you're talking about you went from 21 points per game to just over 15, and then prior to that, you were in the teens 2 years ago. You've got to get some level of consistency on identity on the offensive side of the ball. I thought he would go there before you'd even bring up one player or one element on defense.
If I had told you in February of 2023 that Jordan Riley may be part of helping that rush defense in the fall of 2024, I'd have been kidding you and myself. But I'm thinking to myself right now, after the flashes that we saw of Riley at training camp and during the preseason last year, and then very limited play during the season, I think Jordan Riley, who is a very big-bodied player, could wind up being part of that solution.
No, I'm with you. Certainly a nice young player, but I think it's going to take more than just Dexter Lawrence and Jordan Riley, though, to stop the run.
I would bring back A'Shawn Robinson for sure, to be frank with you. And between Robinson and Riley and Dexter Lawrence, that's 3 very big bodies up front. And a good mixture of some age and some youth, too.
In this division, you have to be able to stop the run. And I don't think that's going to drastically change. I know Dallas obviously had more success through the air. Philadelphia, I think, is going to get back to its bread and butter. But we'll see. Kellen Moore is now the offensive coordinator. And, with what he did in Dallas and the Chargers, I think mixed results in terms of the balance. And I'm very interested to see who Dan Quinn hires as the offensive coordinator, because it doesn't look like it's going to be Eric Bieniemy who's going to hang around.
Probably not.
It's probably going to be somebody new. Which is another, by the way, quick side note. Everybody was campaigning Bieniemy, get away from Kansas City, prove who you could be, and then be in line for the head coach.
That didn't go so well, did it?
Exactly. So, they parted ways with Ron Rivera. Bieniemy was not guaranteed to be the successor, and here we go. Now Bieniemy again is looking for a gig. It's brutal, this coaching industry. Nothing can be guaranteed, regardless of the pathway. As far as the other point, we talked about the 6th pick. I think we had the conversation yesterday, Paul. We said if there's conviction in the room, do not ship the pick. Take the player at that point.
They owe it to themselves to do that. And by the way, wide receiver, which is viewed to be one of the 2 deepest positions in this draft where you could get top-notch guys, we've already seen the last couple of years how some top-notch players have come after the first round at the wide receiver position.
Yeah.
Len, I get what you're saying. You need to get more big-time players on this team. But if you really want a top-notch, candidate to be a number 1 receiver on this team, there's a possibility that Jalen Hyatt could develop into that. Okay, that's first. I don't want to put a ceiling on this player.
But the more you have, the better, I would argue, at that position.
And two, you could very easily, think about it, you got him in the 3rd round last year. You should be very, very happy to grab a potential star receiver in the 2nd round or 3rd round this year, too.
Well, just to use your point
Now,
as an example.
that doesn't mean if Marvin Harrison is there at 6, I wouldn't jump at him.
I figure you would perhaps sing a different tune.
And I must admit that Odunze and Neighbors are incredibly attractive as well. But, for example, Franklin is a guy who's probably going to go second round. I think he's going to be really good. I'm a big Franklin guy.
Well, if you bring up last season's draft, okay, the wide receiver position, you'll find guys that went beyond the first round that had an impact, to your point.
Absolutely.
For example,
how about Rashee Rice for Kansas City?
That was going to be the first guy.
Look what he's done.
Second-round pick. Jaden Reed wasn't necessarily as consistent as some of the other guys.
No.
I think late in the season, though, started to show some flesh. How about Tank Dell before he got hurt for the Houston Texans?
Absolutely.
He was a third-round pick. So there's a few guys. Josh Downs had a very productive season for the Colts.
There are
He was a
impact
third-round
guys
pick.
you could get at receiver after round 1.
Sure, but with that being said, here's where now I want to bring it back to the first round. Zay Flowers to the Ravens, okay?
Huge.
Above all those guys that we just talked about.
Yeah.
Jordan Addison, what he did for the Vikings.
Huge.
Especially with Justin Jefferson getting hurt. So I think it circles back to, I'm with you, Paul. I'm a big believer. The first round is not the end-all, be-all. You've got to be able to find substance elsewhere. But I think based on the history of the draft, the higher you pick, the earlier you address the position, not a guarantee. The chances of that player panning out, though, increase immensely. And that's the point.
You'd like to believe so, for sure. That's the whole idea, because the guys you pick earlier are guys you're supposed to have maximum conviction in. I get it.
So that also, I think, needs to be at least kept in mind. Let's head back to the phone lines. Alex is in Syracuse joining us here on BBKO. What's happening, Alex? What do you got for us?
Hey, guys. Happy Friday. How you doing?
Same
You
to
too. How are you?
Good. Hey, just a few quick things. I'm going to start picking up where you guys just kind of left off. Personally, I think it seems unlikely to me that at 6 that there's not going to be one of those guys that everybody in the room agrees on. And personally, I would be pretty shocked if that guy isn't an offensive tackle, or more likely maybe one of those receivers that you guys were just talking about.
Probably.
Just looking at the top,
If you had to
right?
gauge the percentages, I think you're right.
Given what's going to be probably available around 6 and who those kind of top 10 guys are and just what we need, I think it'd be pretty shocking if they don't pick there, I think personally. And I think it's probably going to be a tackle or a receiver, which honestly, looking at those guys that are hopefully going to be there, I'm pretty happy with a lot of those options. So I kind of had two quick points today. Going back to what you guys were talking about earlier as far as the defensive coordinator, I've been a big component of going from within the organization anyway since Wink left.
Right.
I think Henderson is obviously an amazing option. I think Patterson's also an interesting option.
Mm-hmm.
Neither of them have specific play calling experience exactly, which that was my only kind of caveat.
Well, remember, Patterson was the co-defensive coordinator in Minnesota for a few seasons.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to bring that up, Lance, because that's interesting to me. Because I think my thing is, if you're not going to bring in somebody who has play calling experience, then for me it's like I don't think you're Denard Wilson I think is interesting, but I'm like I like Jerome Henderson. Like, I mean, if you're just going to bring in a guy who's sort of new to that particular thing, give me a guy who already knows these players, who already knows the scheme that they're running, even though they're going to change it. I'd rather have it be from within the building. And to your point, Lance, I did some research and I saw that he was a co-defensive coordinator, which I found really interesting because I can't think of a lot of times where you've seen co-defensive coordinators, which made me wonder. You almost wonder, would they do a thing where they would have both Patterson and Henderson sort of do co-defensive coordinating positions, so that you kind of have somebody in the front and somebody in the back to sort of like navigate this. Right?
Maybe.
I don't know. I started thinking about that, and I thought that was sort of an interesting, because I think both those guys are just, from what you hear, top-notch guys who developed.
Yeah,
guys like
they
Dexter, all
are.
these guys.
They're both well
you wonder if
respected.
those two guys.
Yeah, they're both well
exactly.
respected. And I will say this, the co-coordinator thing is much more prevalent in college than it is in the NFL.
Right.
So that also is definitely something that you brought up. I will say this. I don't know. Coach Patterson has been around a long time, and he did have health issues a couple of years ago. I don't know what his appetite is for a defensive coordinator spot or even a co-spot at this time. I don't know the answer to that. I have not had any conversation with him about adjusting job titles. But that would be something that you'd have to consider too. I mean, if he does not have an appetite for it and he just wants to stick with the defensive line, well, then that option's off the table.
Yeah, because, I mean, think about it. You take on more duties just by you've got to speak to the media on a regular basis. You have a
Mm.
press conference.
Sure.
You don't necessarily have to do that as an assistant, and that may not seem big, but you have to now carve out time during the week to at least address that. So you're a little bit more of the face of the defense. And yes, it is rare, but I mean, I was just going through because I recalled 2021, the Dolphins had co-offensive coordinators under Brian Flores when they moved on from Chan Gailey. So it's not unheard of. And I would say
Belichick
sometimes
had that with the offense this year, too.
Belichick did sometimes,
happens.
but sometimes also the motivation behind that, by the way, is for money, so that you have two individuals because of
Right.
the title and the label to get them pay structure-wise where you want them to be. So it may not be even role, meaning one of the guys is going to have to call the plays. You're not going to have two guys call plays, but at least
Right.
from a title perspective, you get them on the pay scale of where they're deserving because of maybe how much they've meant to the organization, the amount of years and experience they have in the
To the
NFL.
caller's point, though, we're still all in the dark here. So is it possible that both Patterson and Henderson could be co-coordinators and they would figure it out themselves, and then one of the guys would call the plays? I'm absolutely convinced that that could be a possibility. I'm not going to poo-poo that at all because I think the table is wide open.
Well, and I think you also brought up a very interesting point, Alex, about if you're weighing individuals internally that don't have play calling experience versus people outside, wouldn't you then stick with what we were talking about, Paul, the continuity factor?
Sure.
And that's fine, but
That's a good point.
The only thing that I'll throw out is Brendan Daly, for example, has history with Dable going back to New England. So, you can't overlook friendships, relationships, philosophical similarities. That could be something that may tip the scales, just as something to keep in mind. But we went through the candidates based on reports, and as I said, Shane Bowen is the only individual that was the defensive coordinator for his previous team in Tennessee. Outside of that, everybody was more focused on positions as opposed to calling plays. So it's the same wavelength is what we're getting at from that standpoint.
I think personally, either or both of those guys are the options I would love to see going forward. But we'll see how that shakes out. So my major point today, I'll make it brief. I called, I think, exactly a week ago, and I posed the question to you guys that I'd posed to my friend about the Brock Purdy versus Daniel Jones debate about switching, right? And we got a little lost in that hypothetical, and I was trying to get to a bigger point, which we didn't get to, which is fine. So I'd like to get to it today, which is ultimately, maybe for those that weren't listening, all three of us agree that we would take Daniel Jones over Brock Purdy probably most days of the week, and that the scheme and that the pieces that Brock has around him in many ways are a larger factor, and the same way that I think the pieces that Daniel has around him are a larger factor than they themselves as quarterbacks. So for me, ultimately what that brings me to is I think the most important move, potentially, that the Giants will and have made all offseason, even not knowing what they're going to do yet in draft and free agency, I would still bank on the most important thing that they've brought into this building, potentially, is Carmen Brasillo. And again, I'm not saying that I'm banking on it working out. I'm just saying I think, I've been saying it for a decade, the offensive line of the Giants is where everything begins and ends in terms of success for this franchise in the last, 8 to 10 years in a lot of ways. And we like to talk about, obviously Saquon's amazing, and there's receivers out there, and quarterback, and we get caught up in the flashiness of those kinds of players, which I get. But I feel like we as much as we talk about the offensive line sometimes, I think it's just been consistently inconsistent for too long. And so my question to you guys is, personally, I would like to see in the offseason, I think another tackle in the draft, whether it's at 6 or maybe one of those early second-round picks, I think there's some depth there, and I think bringing another guy would be really helpful. And I definitely think a guard potentially in free agency for the money. I think a veteran presence in that room. I think we saw what Justin Pugh sort of offered just in terms of like bringing those guys together and I think raising that offensive line's ability to play this season once he came in. I think more veteran presence in that way. But personally, I look at the line and I look at, Thomas and obviously Smith, and I really hope Neal can pull it together this year. And then I look at guys like Izudu and McKeithen, and I think, look, if a guy like Priscilla can come in and do what he did in Vegas and like kind of take these guys and really bring them together, we could, and again, this is a little optimistic, but we could have a situation where we have a really pretty young offensive line that if they can grow together, we might have a good offensive line for hopefully the next couple of years if they can pull it together. So my question for you two is, look, I know there's a lot of factors, but as we go into free agency and the draft, do you have sort of a sense of where you would put your resources specifically in terms of the offensive line, how high in the draft would you be looking for those kinds of positions, and free agency and sort of tackles versus guards? Where would you guys have that stuff break down?
All right, Alex, appreciate the phone call. I mean, keep in mind, Zudu and McKeithen, you could talk all you want about a coach getting his hands on them. They got to stay healthy. I mean, that's the thing, Paul. The caller, I understand you're promoting the youth movement, but they have to stay on the field, and that's been a question mark for a lot of these players.
The two factors that nobody can answer, and I mean nobody, is how will this new offensive line coach develop these young guys? We don't know. Will they take to him? Will he take to them and bring out the best in what they have to offer? We have no idea. And neither does Joe Shane right now, to be honest, nor does Brian Dable. Then the other question that we also can't answer is, will they be durable enough to stay on the field and provide some assistance? We don't know that either. And that's what makes this so incredibly difficult. Because if you could go right now into the next room and say, oh, it's a guarantee that both of those guys are going to be healthy for 17 games this season, boy, that makes your decision-making process in the offseason so much easier. Even if you don't know about their development. But those two questions, which they have no answer to whatsoever, is what complicates this thing. John keeps saying all the time, you can't put too much weight on hope.
Yeah,
and he's right. You can't. Do I hope that those guys are healthy? I sure do. Do I hope that the offensive line coach can bring out the best in them? I absolutely do. And if both of those things come out affirmative, boy, the Giants are in really good shape. But how much can you lean on hope? Man, that's a hard one to digest.
Well, that's why I'm not banking on that. After 2 seasons, 2022 and 2023, as Zudu and McKeithen have been on the roster, you can't go into year 3 assuming that this is going to be the year that a new offensive line coach gets them to perform at a certain level and they stay healthy. You cannot bank on that. And I've got the free agent list in front of me. Justin Pugh, Ben Bredesen, Shane Lemieux, Matt Peart, all set to hit unrestricted free agency.
Yeah.
So by definition, it goes back to the quarterback position, which has to be addressed. The interior of the offensive line has to be addressed in some capacity, Paul, because both of your starting guards are set to hit the market. One of the backups is set to hit the market, and Matt Peart, he has an expiring rookie contract just like Shane Lemieux. So I would say free agent / draft, if you choose to not bring back any of those names that I just threw out, then you probably have to have a combination of guard in free agency and the draft. And then because of the free agents and the uncertainty of health, you need to have a swing tackle / guy that could start if need be, if one of the two guys doesn't stay healthy.
Well, Tyree Phillips is coming off of the injury, too. And
Sure.
You don't know how well he fits into that mix. I would say this. Ben Bredesen, to me, is one of those guys you really like to have on your roster. But because he's unrestricted, you never know if somebody else is going to give him a little cash and try to steal him away.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Ben Bredesen could be one of the players you bring into the fold, but based on my math, Paul, I think you need to have 3 players. You need to have 2 guards and a tackle at minimum that are either some combination of returning players / new faces. I think minimum you need 3 offensive linemen. And once again, my priority would be the interior because it was a lot of mixing and matching this season. And just based on the numbers game, more guards are set to test the market than tackles.
Yeah, I'd be more inclined to spend the free agency money on a guard than a tackle. I agree with you.
Yeah, because I do think that at 6, if they really love a tackle, they should be in position to grab a tackle. And
either Fashanu or Alt.
Or Alt, yeah.
One of those 2 guys, in all likelihood, will be there at 6.
Yeah, so, I mean, you don't necessarily have to go out. And here's the honest assessment of the NFL. You truly want a difference maker at tackle, you're probably not going to get him in free agency anyway because they're going to get the franchise
much too
tag,
much. Even if you can get them, they're going to cost you a fortune.
Well, but in all likelihood, they're not hitting the market anyway, right?
Probably not.
So that's more of a reason why you have to address that position in the draft. The guard, you can have a combination of one guy in free agency at least, and then one guy in the mid to later rounds
and again,
in terms of the draft.
You still have to solve the Evan Neal puzzle, which is another very big, complicated mess.
Well, and
you just don't know.
And that's why tackle has to be one of your positions to address this offseason for that very reason, Paul. Because let's put it this way. If you're drafting a tackle at 6, you're not drafting him with the idea that he's going to hold the water bottle the entire year, right? You're drafting him with the chance that he's going to come and he's going to compete, and he has a realistic shot to start.
I leave you with this.
Yeah.
Jumbo Elliott was a second-round pick out of Michigan. Just remember that. Second round.
Okay, but second round is still high.
Oh yeah, but it doesn't
at
have
least in the
to.
draft.
It doesn't have to be a pick six.
It doesn't have to be 6, but you're not. Let's put it this way: if you really need to address tackle, Paul, you're not waiting till round 4 or 5 because that's the hope philosophy just as much as Zudo and McKeith.
I tend to agree with you. I think you're going to go a little higher than that.
There has to be a cutoff in terms of the round. All right. Well, with that being said, that is going to wrap up Friday's edition of Big Blue Kickoff Live here on Giants.com. And a reminder that today's episode is part of the Giants platforms everywhere and Giants.com/podcasts. We'll be back up and running again on Monday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern as we recap the Senior Bowl. Also continue to look ahead to what should be a busy offseason.
Hey, I didn't spill the water.
Look at that. That's why the cap crusade paid off, and there was value and substance behind it in terms of you bobbling all over, securing it, and the delayed scoop and score did work as you've reached the end zone. It took you 60 minutes, but you finally got to the pay dirt. For Paul Dottino, I'm Lance Medow. Stay locked to Giants.com for all the latest. We'll speak to you on Monday right here on BBKL. Have a good one.